When the Ottomans seized the convent, the nuns believed martyrdom would be the worst fate. What the empire chose instead was far more brutal, and it left no graves to mourn. The empire moved without hesitation, and the convent could not defend them. Their vows were sacred, yet sacred vows carried no weight against stamped imperial orders. What happened inside those cloistered walls was not simply a disruption of faith, but a deliberate attempt to erase the record of women who had surrendered themselves to God, not to state power. Their transfer was logged as administrative procedure, their silence cataloged as compliance, and their disappearance treated as mere paperwork. Stories like theirs were never meant to survive. Officials learned to speak in euphemisms, clerics avoided written detail, and archives redacted more than they preserved. But you are here, listening, and in doing so you prevent their names from falling back into the quiet they were forced to inhabit. Share this story not for spectacle or controversy, but because remembrance is the only defiance still available to them. And write your city or country in the comments below, so the memory of these women travels farther than the walls that once held them, crossing borders they were never allowed to escape, reminding the world that silence was not their choice. It was the empire's command. To understand what was demanded of those nuns, the world around them must be seen without ornament. The Ottoman frontier was shifting, swallowing Christian territories not through ceremony, but through decrees that traveled faster than armies. Convents that once sat in silence and prayer found themselves reclassified as state assets the moment a new border was drawn. What had been sanctified ground, heavy with incense, scriptures, ritual bells, became a strategic possession in a game of land, influence, and obedience. The empire did not need their prayers, it already had its own. What it needed were bodies that signified victory, sanctity bent under conquest, purity made visible as submission. This was an age when religious institutions were not merely houses of worship, but symbols of sovereignty. To seize a convent was to seize a community's spiritual spine. To take vowed women was to dismantle the last resistance that could not lift a sword. Disappearance, once known for taking Christian boys for imperial service, expanded in practice to encompass sacred women, not publicly, not ceremonially, but through quiet administrative absorption where sanctity could be rewritten without outrage. A convent silence, once voluntary, became mandated through military presence and sealed directives bearing the Sultan's emblem. Europe watched but pretended not to see. Correspondence from bishops grew cautious, filled with vague phrasing and half-truths, while monasteries sent warnings coded in liturgical language. Everyone knew what it meant when the empire took interest in a house of nuns, yet almost no one dared commit detail to ink. Behind the grandeur of imperial courts and the rhetoric of tolerance, another system operated, one where women sworn to God could be repurposed by decree, renamed without sacrament, and relocated without rite. And yet, this is only the beginning. Mother Eleonora was the anchor, the steady breath of the convent long before soldiers crossed its threshold. She carried authority without force, her voice seldom raised, her devotion neither cold nor naive. In a world where faith was expected to bow to empire, she remained composed, knowing resistance would cost them more than prayer could restore. There was a quiet weight in her eyes, a recognition that holiness offered no shield when power demanded proof of dominance. She understood the empire's hunger, yet chose endurance over collapse, even when endurance meant standing alone beneath the gaze of officers trained not to see women, only assets. Sister Mariette was the innocent, scarcely 17, drawn to the veil not through theology, but through fear of a marriage arranged beyond her wishes. The convent had been her escape, a sanctuary where her youth could mature without transaction. She still prayed with urgency, still believed purity could not be touched by decree, still held that God must intervene before the world did. She was gentle, hopeful, and painfully unprepared for the precision with which empires dismantle idealism. To her, the arrival of officials felt like a test of faith. To them, she was simply eligible. Sister Agatha was the witness, older than Mariette, but not yet hardened like Eleonora. She read the world as scripture, every movement, every silence, every sealed document interpreted with the gravity of prophecy. Where others sought to forget, she collected details. Before records were confiscated, before ink was burned from vellum, She had already begun writing names, dates, descriptions with a hand that shook only from urgency. Agatha carried a truth few dared hold. Memory itself was rebellion, and written memory was treason. Each of them would be tested in ways they had never contemplated. Faith stripped not by doubt, but by power that recognized no altar but its own. The first breach did not arrive with shattered doors or shouted commands. It came with quills, ink, and parchment, imperial documents carried by a courier whose polished boots announced authority more effectively than any weapon. Dawn light spilled across the courtyard as the convent sisters gathered, drawn by the muted rhythm of hooves and metal. The soldiers who entered did not brandish steel. They carried silence with practiced discipline, the kind that signals a system so entrenched in power it no longer needs to demonstrate it. Mother Eleonora greeted them because ritual demanded it, though she already sensed the futility of courtesy. The lead officer spoke only long enough to confirm identity. Hers, the convent's, the land on which it stood. The decree he carried did not accuse nor negotiate. It simply declared, what once belonged to God's vocation was now property of the Sultan's dominion. The ink was already dry, the signatures layered with calligraphic precision, centuries of bureaucracy legitimizing the seizure in a few composed lines. The chapel bells continued their morning peal, but the sound faltered against the rigid posture of Ottoman envoys. Incense lingered in the air, yet devotion no longer described the atmosphere. Ownership did. The measure of each corridor began, officers noting square footage, the number of sleeping chambers, the amount of cloth to be repurposed. Even the rosaries collected on prayer tables were counted, small beads transformed into inventory. Nothing was stolen, nothing destroyed. That was precisely what made it unbearable. The soldiers observed everything without acknowledgement of the human lives before them. Their focus was architectural, logistical, territorial. Windows tall enough for watch placement, storerooms capable of conversion, cells that could be reclassified as holding quarters. Their restraint was clinical. It implied that conquest could be executed with dignity, that the removal of agency could be conducted without raised voice or bloodshed. When the second delegation arrived at dusk, the transformation sharpened. They carried not weapons, but wooden screens, partition cloths, sealing wax, and administrative ledgers. Prayer rooms were assessed for their potential to become offices. The refectory where the sisters broke bread in quiet ritual was marked for use as an intake chamber. The dormitory hallway was measured, not for comfort, but for capacity. Every corner of God's home was reinterpreted into a secular function. Sister Mariette, still too young to understand the subtlety of conquest, waited for an act of cruelty to confirm her fear, shouting, assault, desecration. But none came. Instead, she watched a rosary taken from its peg, inspected as if it were a tax record rather than a prayer tool. Her innocence cracked not under violence, but under the realization that an empire could erase sanctity without ever touching her flesh. Sister Agatha, ever observant, recorded what she could while she could. She noted uniforms, seals, dates, even the rhythm of footsteps along the cloister floor. She understood with chilling clarity that history tends to forget what is not written. The officers who paced the convent that night would vanish into archives as mere functionaries, while the nuns would disappear without annotation, unless she wrote. Mother Eleonora, seasoned by decades of quiet leadership, understood the danger more deeply than either of them. Physical harm she could resist, since she could confess. But this was not sin. This was dissolution, a slow, bureaucratic dismantling of the sacred. No flames would touch their chapel. No swords would slice their veils. Instead, holiness was being consumed by procedure, filed, categorized, and repurposed. Most historians later softened the language, calling this an administrative realignment, a protective transfer, an integration into imperial care. But the ledgers, when they resurfaced centuries later, told a colder truth. The convent did not fall by siege or sacrilege. It was reorganized into silence, its women absorbed into a system that did not need to harm their bodies to possess them. And beneath the stillness of the stone corridors, as soldiers paced with soft steps and officials annotated their existence, every sister understood what the empire truly excelled at: conquest without noise, erasure without rupture, domination without visible scar. What came next, Even the ledgers could not fully explain. This is where obedience was tested, where vows met decree, where the line between faith and governance dissolved into something neither church nor empire ever dared name. And just when the sisters believed the worst had been imposed, when the ink had dried on the decrees and the first night had passed, they realized the true danger was not the soldiers, nor the paperwork, nor the loss of their chapel. It was the empire itself, patient and precise, reimagining them as objects rather than people. Their vows of chastity, devotion, and silence were no longer barriers. They were blueprints for control. The convent had not been conquered with fire, but with policy. Every room measured, every rosary counted, every name recorded in a ledger became a claim, a note in the empire's inventory of obedience. The sisters were not to be killed, nor converted. They were to be absorbed. Mother Eleonora was tasked with supervising others while herself placed under surveillance. Sister Mariette, barely old enough to understand her fate, was selected for service, a polite word that masked something far more sinister. Sister Agatha's ledger, meant to preserve memory, suddenly carried an additional burden. It had to capture the bureaucratic repurposing of sacred women, without which no one would ever believe the full scale of what had occurred. The first night of this service revealed an even harsher truth. Chambers meant for prayer became offices of control. Dormitories became places of inspection. Every action, no matter how small, was logged and observed. The empire did not need to threaten them with death. It had found a more lasting power: the complete removal of agency, the transformation of sanctity into administrative utility. According to surviving records, some women were assigned to palace service, not as concubines in the traditional sense, but as living symbols of conquest, their presence a demonstration of dominion over faith. Other records suggest they were relocated under new names, carefully erased from convent registries, their existence noted only in classified ledgers meant to vanish with time. And yet, paradoxically, some nuns disappeared into obscurity by choice. A few, understanding the depth of their empire's intent, accepted service or relocation in order to avoid more immediate humiliation, to survive within the system that sought to own them. Survival, however, carried its own cost. Identity, devotion, and even memory became commodities traded for life. The real danger was not the outside threat, it was inside. Not the swords, but the silence. Not the soldiers, but the system. The convent had not fallen, it had been absorbed. And in that absorption, what the empire demanded was far worse than death. The air turned cold, heavier than any winter morning the sisters had known. Even the stone walls seemed to hold their breath, as though the convent itself recognized the weight of what had come. Mother Eleonora stood at the edge of the refectory, her hands clenched around a single rosary, watching as Sister Mariette was led to her assigned quarters, small, bare, and stripped of every personal token. The girl trembled, but not from fear of pain. She trembled from the slow recognition that her devotion, her identity, and her sanctuary were now subject to someone else's authority. Sister Agatha wrote feverishly by candlelight, recording every detail, every transfer, every whispered command. Ink on paper became resistance, memory became a weapon. Each letter she formed was a defiance against erasure, a fragile tether to a past the empire sought to obliterate. In the silence of the convent, she realized that survival alone was no victory. Endurance required secrecy, cunning, and the acceptance that their lives would no longer belong to them. Mother Eleonora refused the small courtesies offered by the officials. She would not bow, would not sign documents she did not understand, would not participate in ceremonies that disguised captivity as cooperation. The punishment was immediate, but subtle. She was isolated, denied the company of her sisters, left to wander corridors where shadows had become companions. Every step she took echoed not with her own authority, but with the weight of invisible eyes. The chapel, once a refuge, now served as a silent reminder of what had been taken. Crosses were removed, icons scraped, bells silenced. Candle flames flickered against the walls, casting elongated shadows that seemed to whisper of lost devotion. In that darkness, the sisters understood the extent of their predicament. Their faith could not protect them, their obedience could not spare them, and their silence could not hide them. In that silence, they understood what must be done. Not a single act of rebellion would save them, but the preservation of memory, the careful chronicling of events, the secret ledger. These small acts became their resistance. Survival was not enough. They had to ensure that even if the empire succeeded in claiming their bodies and spaces, it could not claim their stories. The convent had become a theater of despair, where every ritual, every corridor, every whisper carried the weight of subjugation. Yet, amid the oppression, the women found a quiet, brutal clarity. The empire could break vows, confiscate spaces, and repurpose lives, but it could not extinguish the record of what they endured. In the echoing stillness, that fragile truth was all that remained. Decades passed before the convent, silent and unyielding, offered any sign of what had truly transpired within its walls. It was during routine restoration work that a loose floorboard, long ignored beneath the altar of the chapel, revealed its secret. Beneath the dust and rot, a small, leather-bound ledger lay hidden, its edges frayed, its cover mottled with time, its pages yellowed, yet the ink still discernible. Every line, carefully penned, contained a detailed record of names, dates, transfers, and assignments. Sister Agatha's hand, shaking with urgency as she wrote in secrecy, had preserved a truth that the empire had tried to erase entirely. The ledger did more than list the women. It revealed the meticulous system of their subjugation. Some had been assigned to palace service, not as martyrs or converts, but as instruments of control, their presence signaling the empire's dominance over a faith it could not conquer by open battle. Others were relocated under new names, erased from convent registries and church annals, their identities rewritten on paper, as if obliterating memory could also erase existence. A few disappeared entirely, their fates hidden in corridors and chambers no outsider would enter, their stories thought lost to time. Yet here, on fragile parchment, their lives resurfaced, undeniable and precise. The ledger was more than a bureaucratic record. It was a testament, a warning, and a memorial. It proved that what the sisters endured was neither random cruelty nor mismanagement. It was deliberate, systematic, and insidious. Each page chronicled not just physical relocation, but the stripping of agency, the disassembly of spiritual authority, and the quiet destruction of community bonds. What had appeared to be a silent conquest, measured, calm, bureaucratic, was revealed in full horror. An empire had seized not just bodies, but the essence of devotion itself. Perhaps the most haunting detail was Agatha's subtle commentary in the margins, a note of fear here, a question there, small observations about who remained defiant and who was silently broken. In her encoded annotations lay a human pulse, a witness speaking across time, ensuring that the experience of these women would not dissolve entirely into silence. The revelation reframed history. It was no longer speculation or rumor. It was proof. The nuns had endured a form of domination far beyond physical threat. Their faith, their vows, their identities had been weaponized, cataloged, and manipulated. They had not merely survived. They had fought for memory itself. Every name inscribed in that ledger was a refusal to vanish. Every recorded transfer, every signature, every detail of enforced obedience became a testament that even in the face of absolute power, the act of remembering could resist erasure. They were not trying merely to survive. They were trying to be remembered. And in that dusty corner beneath the chapel, time finally honored their struggle, giving voice to women who had been silenced for centuries, reminding the world that truth, once witnessed, cannot be entirely extinguished. Historians continue to debate the motives behind the empire's treatment of the convent and its nuns, and the truth may lie somewhere between multiple uncomfortable possibilities. One theory suggests the women were political leverage, a way to neutralize the influence of Christian institutions without declaring open war. By seizing the convents and reassigning the nuns, the empire demonstrated control over both land and belief, signaling that even sanctity could bend under imperial authority. Another hypothesis claims demographic and social control was at play. By absorbing young, devoted women into palace service or assigning them under new identities, the empire may have aimed to disrupt Christian lineage continuity. These women were no longer free to form families or continue monastic traditions. Their devotion was repurposed, their influence redirected, and their communities left spiritually and numerically weakened. A third perspective emphasizes psychological and symbolic dominance. Purity, once sacred, became a tool of the empire, a visible marker of conquest over faith itself. The nuns were not meant to convert, nor die, nor rebel openly. They were to exist as silent evidence that even the most devout could be claimed, cataloged, and controlled. In this reading, the empire's goal was less administrative than psychological, absolute power expressed through the systematic erasure of autonomy. Yet the ledger discovered centuries later hints at a more human, less strategic truth. The women were not mere assets. They were people whose lives were seized, whose faith endured under extreme duress, and whose resistance existed in memory and record. The empire may have sought to dominate, but it could not erase the human impulse to bear witness. Ultimately, the hypotheses converge on a single, unsettling conclusion. The sisters' suffering was not incidental, and their captivity was not accidental. The empire did not merely punish or conquer. It designed a system in which survival required the sacrifice of identity, devotion, and agency. And the evidence points to something far more human than imperial strategy: the quiet courage of women striving to be remembered in a world determined to forget them. Empires rise and fall, kingdoms redraw borders, and centuries pass. But the weight of what happened within those convent walls lingers long after stone and ink have faded. The world forgets quickly, official records omit, historians sanitize, and narratives shift to fit the victor's version of events. Yet a single ledger, hidden beneath floorboards for generations, proves that memory can survive even the most systematic attempts at erasure. The nuns were taken, cataloged, and repurposed, not for sin, not for betrayal, not for defiance, but simply for the existence of their faith, their devotion, and the autonomy it represented. Their bodies, once consecrated, became instruments of control, their voices silenced, their identities rewritten. And yet, in their quiet acts of preservation, Agatha's ink, Eleanora's endurance, Mariette's reluctant witness, they ensured that their suffering would speak across centuries. The convent walls, emptied of devotion, became a tomb of memory, but one that could not fully close. The names, the dates, the subtle observations etched in hidden ledgers are proof that even under absolute domination, humanity endures in the act of testimony. And because you are still here, listening, their voices echo again. You witness what the empire tried to erase. You honor what the world tried to silence. In the shadow of history's violence, remembrance becomes resistance, and memory becomes immortality. Their devotion was seized. Their sanctity was cataloged. Their silence was enforced. But their story, once hidden, now survives. If you want more stories rescued from hidden rooms, erased ledgers, and vanished voices, subscribe.